Muhammad Hijab asks Yasir Qadhi, if you were handed a blank mushaf, a blank manuscript, what would you write on it? And what he's asking is, of the various aruf, of the various versions, because there's some are popular in Pakistan, some are popular in India, some are popular in Indonesia, there's the one popular in the West. What would you write? Now, I'm really hoping that Yasir will watch all of this. I know it takes time, but I'm hoping that he will. As soon as I heard him say that, first of all, I both listened to it and I watched Yasir Qadhi's reaction. And I could not help but immediately think of how many times I've had King James only advocates ask me, okay, what is the perfect English Bible at this point? Because in their mindset, even though the English language didn't exist when the Bible was revealed, there has to be a specific, and there can't be anything else. If there's any variation whatsoever, well, then I just can't believe any of it. That's the mindset in the King James onlyist, and I would argue it's the mindset in the TR onlyist as well, if you really push them. That mindset was what was behind the question being asked of Yasir Qadhi. Because Yasir Qadhi's response is, it's just not that simple. And Muhammad Hijab is, but it needs to be that simple. There needs to be a yes and no. And Qadhi's, there can't be. Because Yasir understands the history of transmission. He understands that you have multiple lines here. In fact, from my perspective, I think the aruf would go back to early variants. Maybe some of these have to do with the way that things were memorized by a particular memorizer that went to a particular area. And so that becomes the popular reading there. But obviously, Dr. Qadhi, Ibn Masud, there's huge evidence in the Islamic sources that Ibn Masud's readings in many places varied. The early tafsir literature records places where Ibn Masud's readings differed from Uthman's. And logically, that would be a first place to look for the original source of the different qira'at and the rise of the aruf. You know, applying standard textual critical thinking and methodology, even though there is a difference with how the Qur'an is transmitted, there's still that reality that it's a document that has to go through human hands, and it has a history to it. And it was a shorter history than the New Testament, so I do not expect there to be nearly as many differences, especially meaningful differences. There can't be. There cannot be. You know why there cannot be? Because the Qur'an is only about half the size of the New Testament. And it was only transmitted for approximately 900 years before it goes into print. And printing doesn't stop development, but it massively slows it down. Whereas the New Testament has to go through a millennium and a half before 1,350 years. Before printing takes place. And that's not even talking about the original language. That was in Latin before when it was first printed by Gutenberg. Anyway, so there are differences. There are fundamental differences. Time-wise, the size of the text, the kind of scribal errors that would be made in looking at an Arabic text versus a Greek text, for example. These are all issues that come up. And then, of course, the role of revision, because that free versus controlled transmission issue is massive when it comes to textual critical issues and things like that. So Muhammad Hijab wants a Salafi answer. And I have people who come up to me all the time who want the Christian corresponding to a Salafi answer. They want an absolute, there's no questions. I'm going to ignore the textual history. They're willing to trade truth for certainty. Okay? There are Christians who are willing to do that. There are Muslims who are willing to do that. And that's trading truth for certainty is a pretty popular thing. Really is. And so Muhammad Hijab is going, and Yasir Qadhi won't do it. He did, however, eventually, what he said was, this is a very advanced topic. You need to be talking with people who can read Arabic. And he's saying this is not something you talk about amongst people without preparing them. And I've said similar things. I mean, I've been spending decades of my life trying to educate Christians about the history of their own texts so that we can talk about these things. Because you've got the Bart Ehrmans running around making their arguments, and people need to know how to respond to them. But I get what Yasir Qadhi was saying, but he did say very quickly to Muhammad Hijab that what he would write down would be a mixture of the various aruf. Now, what that tells me is that what he's saying is, well, we have to look at the readings and do what? Apply standard principles of textual criticism, which is what Christian scholars do every single day. Every single day. But this is now an explosion of shock amongst Muslims that a conservative, believing Muslim scholar would say you need to apply textual critical principles. This isn't an explosion or shock for me, but it is for most Muslims. And certainly Yasir Qadhi needs to understand that when Christians talk to Muslims, the Muslim understanding of their own text is not the same as his understanding of their own text as to its history and its transmission over time. Now, why do I hope? I really hope that what this is going to do, what I hope it doesn't result in, is some massive pushback that silences Western Muslims from honestly dealing with the history of their text. That would be horrific. That would be the wrong direction to go. My hope is that this will open doors for further discussion, because what have I been saying? Out there by himself, the strange fellow who, before he debated Shabir Ally for the first time, listened to hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of Shabir Ally lectures while riding a bike to understand, get hold of the resources, try to accurately represent what the other side has to say, use equal scales. I'm not going to make an argument against the Qur'an that would then be equally opposite against the New Testament. You can't do that, and that's what has been done in the vast majority of the debates that I've done with Muslims. They've used one standard for the Qur'an and a different standard for the New Testament. My hope is, with the comments that are being made by people like Yasir Qadhi, that there would be a recognition that we've been right all along. You need to use the same standards. You need to use the same standards. And hence, my hope would be that people like Muhammad Hijab would hear that and go, all right, we've got some catch up to do. Let's learn the basic principles of textual critical study. We want to get as close to what was originally given by Muhammad as possible. Right? I mean, that's the goal of New Testament textual criticism. I want to know what the apostles wrote, not what somebody 50 years, 100 years, 300 years, 500 years later thought should have written. So we need to do that and get hold of resources like this and get hold of resources like the top copy manuscript, and we need to start pushing for a critical edition of the Quran. I have said over and over and over and over again, when you're reading this Quran, there are no footnotes. There are no footnotes. There are no references to where the readings differ. There are no references to where the consonantal text differs, or the vowel pointing, or the printings where the mushaf have different readings. There's nothing like that. That's what you need. We have that. We have that. Anytime you grab the Nestle-Aland edition of the Greek New Testament, there it is. Ding, 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 ding. And see the notes at the bottom of the page? There they are. We have that. You don't. And I've been pointing this out since about 2006 and saying this is a major difference between us, and for us to really meaningfully discuss, because we have to meaningfully discuss. This is not a subject that you can just simply leave off to the side. Your text talks about our books. Historically, your text comes after our book, half a millennium afterwards, and your text says to the Al-Injil, the people of the gospel, that we are to make decisions based upon what's in the gospel. Well, that means we need to know what's in our gospel. But that also seems to mean that at the time that was written, the gospel still existed. And so your text refers to our text and says that our text was natsal, it was sent down. So we can't avoid this conversation. It may be difficult, may be hard, may take a while, but you can't avoid this conversation. And here's my hope. Once you have recognized the textual history of the Quran and then the textual history of the New Testament, I'm going to present to you a strong argument that the free transmission of the text of the New Testament gives you a much higher reliability to the resultant text that I have right here than the controlled text gives you to this right here. It does. And I want to be able to explain that to you. And to be honest with you, in the vast majority of the debates, I get to that point and my Muslim friends stop hearing me because they just simply don't believe there's a textual history to look at in the first place. But once your own leaders are telling you that, then maybe finally we can get that next step taken, and now we can start talking here, and we can start talking about intertextuality. That is the fact that the Quran makes reference to stories in both the Old and New Testaments, the Tanakh and the New Testament, and we could talk about what their sources were. And then we can start having serious discussion about what the author of the Quran did and did not know about the sources that he was utilizing. Because if you are using sources to reconstruct the text of the Quran, which is what you're talking about doing, you may not, right now you just may be going, no, I will not, no, I can't go there. But that's what textual criticism is. It's utilizing the sources that have been given to you to reconstruct the text. Then you have to start asking questions about, given that yours is the third of three, won't use that. I'm not sure that's the best phrase I want to use because you know how that's used. Different context. You've got the Old Testament, you've got the Hebrew Scriptures, made reference to in the Quran, the story of Lot, for example, told 4 or 5 different times in the Quran. What sources did the author use to come up with the story of Lot? You have New Testament. Almost no, there's really no direct reference. But you have stories about Jesus right there in the text of the Quran. And then you have Surah 5, which connects all of them together. Says God sent down the Torah to Moses, sent down the Injil to Jesus, and now you've got the Quran to Muhammad. They're connected together. Now that you recognize they all have a history, a textual history behind them, now we can start talking about the relationship they have to one another. Because when we boil it all down, What all of us are having to talk about is the fact that you prioritize the Qur'an, even though it's only half, it's much smaller than the New Testament. You prioritize that over the other two, and why? We might actually be able to start having meaningful conversation based upon equal scales. Upon equal scales. So that's my hope. And this is what drives all of you crazy. You know I care about you. When I get to sit down with you guys and have lunch and have dinner, you know I really do care about you guys. And so this is a great opportunity to make some strides and to get the word out. And maybe you guys can put some pressure because, trust me, stuff like a critical edition Greek New Testament doesn't just pop into existence. There has to be funding. There has to be funding. And you need a critical edition of the Quran. A real one. Not one made up by people just to try to, well, this is what Uthman had and that's good enough for us. No, I want you guys to be able to look me in the eye and say, we want to know what Muhammad said, not what somebody later said. I want to know too. I want to know too. Because once we're there, now we can ask the question, all right, now that we know what he said, how does that compare with what came before him, which he said he was consistent with? And right now, all I get is, well, we reject what your text says because it's been changed. But if you're now having to do textual criticism, recognizing you should have been doing it all along, you can't just turn around and say that. Because I can say, well, you're having to do text criticism too. So what? Now we can actually start talking about the substance of what our books actually say. This is big. This is important. And if you are a person absolutely dedicated to truth, this should not be something that you are going to in any way resist. So you Salafi that are mad at Yasir Qadhi, he was telling the truth. He was simply telling the truth. Once you know this, and then you ask the question, okay, what's the final text? You have to go, it's going to depend upon what we're looking at and what sources we're using. That's the reality. That's called being truthful.